The aberrant hunger. There are few sights in the grim darkness of the 42nd millennium more terrifying than the approach of a tyrannid hive fleet. Yet even among the great devourer's countless broods, something unprecedented had emerged from the eastern fringe. Where other hive fleets consumed worlds with mindless hunger, hive fleet Kronos devoured them with purpose. Not mere sustenance drove these alien swarms, but something far more sinister. The galaxy reeled in the wake of the great rift's tearing. Chaos poured through reality's wounds like poison through torn flesh, and demon worlds sprouted where once proud imperial systems had stood. The plague wars had left entire sectors rotting under Nurgle's blessing, while Khorne's followers bathed star systems in blood. It was into this maelstrom of corruption that Kronos had first emerged, not as scavenger, but as predator. The Magos biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus had first noted the anomaly in the fleet's feeding patterns. Where Leviathan consumed all biomass with equal efficiency, Kronos showed preference. It sought worlds touched by chaos, demon-haunted planets where the warp had left its mark upon reality. The Xenos fleet did not avoid these tainted systems as other hive fleets might. Instead, it hunted them. Across a dozen systems, the pattern had repeated. Kronos would arrive where chaos cultists had performed their blasphemous rituals, where demon princes had walked among mortals, where the very soil writhed with unnatural life. The shadow in the warp that preceded all tyrannid invasions was different here. Stronger, more focused. Where other hive minds cast a wide net of psychic suppression, Kronos wielded its influence like a blade, cutting through the immaterial realm with surgical precision. The first to witness this aberrant behavior had been the survivors of Mordheim's fall. Chaos Space Marines of the Death Guard had claimed the world for their pestilent god, transforming its cities into gardens of decay. When Kronos descended upon them, the traitor Astartes had expected the usual swarm tactics of the great devourer. They had not expected their demonic allies to writhe in agony before the approaching fleet ever made planetfall. Great unclean ones, those towering embodiments of Nurgle's generosity, had simply vanished as Kronos' shadow fell across the world. Plague-bearers dissolved into wisps of confused psychic energy. The very corruption that had taken decades to cultivate withered and died before bioships even reached the atmosphere. What remained was not the sterile consumption that marked other tyrannid invasions, but something worse. The Chaos Marines had found themselves fighting creatures that seemed to learn from each demon they destroyed, bioforms that adapted not just to their weapons, but to the very nature of chaos itself. Those few who escaped the slaughter spoke of impossible things. Ripper swarms that consumed not just flesh, but the lingering essence of demon blood. Tyrannid warriors whose synaptic connections pulsed with energies that should not exist in the material realm. Carnifexes whose carapaces gleamed with colors that belonged in the warp alone. The survivors whispered of a hive fleet that did not merely devour corruption, but digested it, learned from it, evolved beyond it. The hive mind of Kronos had tasted something in those early conquests that other fleets had never encountered. In the consumed flesh of cultists, in the psychic residue of demon manifestations, in the very atoms of chaos-touched matter, there existed something beyond mere biological material. There was power here, raw and unfiltered, the kind of energy that shaped reality itself. Where other tyrannid organisms would find such essence indigestible, Kronos had evolved specialized organs to process it. Norn queens within the bioships began producing creatures the Imperium had never catalogued, organisms whose neural pathways sparked with unnatural electricity, whose synaptic fluid ran with colors that hurt to perceive. The fleet's synapse creatures developed new classifications, their consciousness expanding beyond the typical hive mind connection to encompass something larger, something that touched the immaterial realm directly. Each world consumed added to this growing collection of adapted bioforms. On Hellion Prime, where Khorne's followers had erected brass monuments to the blood god, Kronos creatures developed resistance to psychic fury. On Sorrow's End, where Slanesh cultists had performed their excess-fueled rituals, the fleet spawned organisms immune to sensation and pain. With every chaos-tainted world devoured, Kronos learned. With every demon destroyed, it adapted. With every corrupted soul consumed, it evolved. The Adeptus Astartes chapter, known as the Iron Hands, had first coined the term that would spread throughout imperial record-keeping, the God-Eater Fleet. They had encountered Kronos in the aftermath of a demon incursion, watching in horrified fascination as tyrannid bioforms consumed not just the physical remnants of demonic manifestation, but the psychic echoes themselves. Where once a greater daemon had stood, leaving behind only the memory of corruption in the warp, Kronos left nothing, not even echoes. The implications troubled the most learned scholars of the Ordo Malleus. Demons were beings of pure warp energy, manifestations of the Chaos God's will-given form. They could be banished, their material forms destroyed, but their essence would return to the realm of their patron deity. Kronos appeared to be consuming that essence entirely, breaking down the fundamental components of chaos itself and integrating them into its own alien biology. Yet this was merely the beginning of something far more profound. Deep within the consciousness of the hive mind, a new hunger was stirring. Not the simple biological imperative to consume biomass that drove all tyrannid fleets, but an intellectual fascination with the nature of divinity itself. The great devourer had always adapted to overcome its prey. Now, for the first time in its history, it faced prey that existed beyond the purely physical realm. In the bioneural networks that connected every Kronos organism across light-years of space, new patterns began to form. Synaptic pathways that had never existed in any previous hive fleet configuration started to develop. The consciousness of Kronos was evolving beyond its original parameters, growing to encompass concepts that should have been alien to any material intelligence. Concepts of worship, of divine power, of the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. The hive mind began to perceive what the consumed psychic energy represented. This was not mere nutrition, but the building blocks of godhood itself. The essence that sustained beings who commanded the very fabric of the immaterial realm, who shaped the destinies of entire species, who existed beyond the constraints of physical reality. And if such essence could be consumed, could be digested and understood, then perhaps it could be claimed. Across the void, other hive fleets sensed the changes occurring within their distant cousin. Behemoth paused in its feeding to examine the strange new biosignatures emanating from Kronos. Leviathan's own consciousness touched briefly against Kronos's expanded awareness and recoiled from what it found there. This was no longer simply another splinter of the great devourer's will. This was something new, something unprecedented in the millions of years of tyrannid evolution. But imagine for a moment if this aberrant hunger continued to grow. Imagine if the consumption of chaos essence was not merely an adaptation, but the first step toward something far more ambitious. What if the hive mind of Kronos began to hunger not just for the servants of the dark gods, but for the gods themselves? What if evolution had found a way to devour divinity itself? The galaxy trembled at the implications. In the deep reaches of space, Hive Fleet Kronos continued its relentless advance, its bioships pulsing with energies that should not exist in the material realm. Behind it lay a trail of worlds not merely consumed, but cleansed of corruption in ways that even the most radical inquisitors could barely comprehend. Ahead lay targets, richer in the psychic essence it had learned to crave. The hunt for gods had begun. Echoes in the void. The scourge stars burned with sickly light as Hive Fleet Kronos emerged from the warp's embrace. Here, in this blighted region of space, the plague wars had left their mark upon reality itself. Demon worlds still festered with Nurgle's gifts, yet something had changed since the Death Guard's retreat. Where once the corruption had spread with inexorable certainty, now it flickered like dying embers. The Plague Father's influence waned, and in that weakness, Kronos sensed opportunity. Mortarion's defeat at the hands of Robout Guilliman had sent shockwaves through the immaterial realm. The demon Primarch's humiliation had diminished his patron's power, leaving Nurgle's domain vulnerable in ways not seen since the war in heaven. Across a dozen systems, plague worlds that had thrived under demonic influence now showed signs of decay. Not the beautiful rot that Nurgle cherished, but true death. The kind of sterile ending that the plague god feared above all else. The first world Kronos encountered bore the scars of this divine weakness. Ixion Tertius had once been a garden world of the Imperium, its verdant fields and crystal lakes a testament to human achievement. The Death Guard's arrival had transformed it into something else entirely. Plague trees grew where wheat once swayed, their diseased fruit weeping phosphorescent ichor. Rivers ran thick with blessed contagion, while the very air shimmered with blessed spores. Yet as Kronos bioships descended through the atmosphere, the Synapse creatures detected something unprecedented. The corruption was unstable, its cellular structure breaking down at the molecular level. Where demon-touched vegetation should have resisted all attempts at consumption, the tyrannid digestive acids found purchase. For the first time in recorded history, the Great Devourer was successfully breaking down matter that bore the direct blessing of a chaos god. The first wave of Ripper swarms fell upon the plague forests with typical tyrannid efficiency. Their razor-sharp teeth, evolved to tear through adamantium and bone alike, found the corrupted bark surprisingly yielding. As they fed, something extraordinary occurred. The consumed biomass did not simply provide nutrition. It carried within its genetic structure echoes of divine power, fragments of Nurgle's own essence that had been used to sustain the corruption. Within the digestive chambers of the smallest tyrannid organisms, specialized organs began to form. Glands that had never existed in any previous evolutionary cycle started producing enzymes capable of processing psychic energy. Neural pathways expanded beyond their original configurations, creating new connections that touched upon the immaterial realm itself. The hive mind watched with growing fascination as its most basic creatures underwent transformation. The Norn queens aboard Kronos' bioships received this genetic data with unprecedented hunger. Their vast consciousness analyzed every molecular detail of the consumed corruption, cataloging the divine signature that marked Nurgle's influence. For millions of years, the tyrannid species had evolved through the consumption of biological material. Now, for the first time, they were adapting to digest the fundamental forces of chaos itself. New spawning cycles began immediately. The bioship's breeding chambers pulsed with unnatural light as organisms never before conceived took shape within amniotic pods. Tyrannid warriors emerged with synaptic connections that sparked with warp energy. Carnifexes developed carapaces that gleamed with colors that existed beyond the visible spectrum. Hormagaunts scuttled from their birthing pools with neural configurations designed specifically to hunt demon-touched prey. On the surface of Ixion Tertius, the transformation accelerated. Massive hierophants, those living siege engines of the hive fleet, began consuming entire plague groves in single mouthfuls. Their bioplasma cannons, once designed to melt through fortress walls, now fired projectiles that disrupted the molecular bonds of chaos corruption itself. Where their weapons struck, the diseased landscape withered not into healthy ground, but into something stranger. The very atoms seemed to forget their allegiance to Nurgle, reverting to base matter that the Tyranids could process with ease. The shadow in the warp that accompanied all Tyranid invasions began to change as well. Where once it had simply suppressed psychic activity through overwhelming neural pressure, it now actively hunted for traces of divine influence. Tendrils of the hive mind's consciousness reached into the immaterial realm, following the psychic signatures of consumed corruption back to their source. For the first time in its existence, the great devourer was learning to perceive the realm of gods and demons. Deep within the planet's core, where Nurgle's influence had taken deepest root, the hive mind encountered something that should have been impossible to comprehend. Embedded within the very foundation of the corruption was a fragment of pure divinity. Not the reflected power of a demon or the borrowed strength of a cultist, but a piece of Nurgle himself, a microscopic portion of the Chaos God's own essence, left behind when his influence first claimed the world. The discovery sent shockwaves through every synapse creature in the fleet. Here was proof that the divine could indeed be consumed, that the power of the gods was not beyond the reach of evolution. The hive mind began to understand that what it had tasted was merely the beginning. If fragments of divine essence could be digested and processed, then larger portions might also be within reach. The bio-titans began to change their feeding patterns, where once they had simply consumed biomass for its nutritional value, they now sought out specific types of corruption. Organisms that had been touched directly by demonic influence became priority targets. Plague-bearers that materialized to defend their domain found themselves facing predators specifically evolved to counter their nature. The Tyranid adaptive capability, honed over millions of years of evolution, turned its focus upon the fundamental forces of chaos. As the consumption of Ixion Tertius continued, other changes became apparent. The shadow in the warp began to feed upon the psychic residue of consumed corruption, growing stronger with each divine fragment absorbed. Where other hive fleets cast their psychic suppression like a net, Kronos wielded its influence like a surgical instrument. The hive mind was learning to manipulate the boundaries between real space and the warp itself. Across the Scourge stars, similar patterns emerged. On Mordax Prime, where great unclean ones had once held court, Kronos organisms consumed the very dais stones where demons had materialized. On Sickness Falls, the fleet devoured plague rivers that had flowed with blessed corruption for centuries. Each world added new genetic templates to the fleet's expanding repertoire. Each consumed fragment of divine essence taught the hive mind more about the nature of godhood itself. The Norn queens began producing organisms with capabilities that defied conventional understanding. Synapse creatures that could perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. Ripper swarms whose digestive systems could break down the molecular bonds of warp energy. Carnifexes whose bioplasma cannons fired projectiles that existed partially in the immaterial realm. The great devourer was evolving beyond the constraints of physical reality. Yet with each adaptation, each successful consumption of divine essence, the hive mind's hunger grew more sophisticated. No longer content with mere fragments and echoes, it began to crave larger portions of divine power. The taste of godhood, once experienced, could never be forgotten. Deep within its vast consciousness, Kronos began to contemplate possibilities that no Tyrannid fleet had ever considered. The consumption of Ixion Tertius marked more than another victory in the fleet's advance. It represented the first successful digestion of divine essence by a living organism. The hive mind had crossed a threshold that separated the merely biological from the transcendent. What had begun as simple adaptation had become something far more ambitious. The hunt for fragments was ending. The pursuit of gods themselves had begun. In the depths of space, the bioships pulsed with energies that should not exist in the material realm. Their hulls gleamed with patterns that hurt to perceive directly, while their weapon systems charged with power, drawn from realms beyond conventional understanding. Hive Fleet Kronos continued its relentless advance, no longer merely consuming worlds, but learning from them. Learning about the nature of divinity itself. The galaxy trembled at the implications. The weakened god. In the deepest reaches of the Imperium, where thought becomes reality and emotion takes physical form, the garden of Nurgle writhed in unprecedented distress. For the first time in millennia, the Plague Father's domain showed signs not of beautiful decay, but of true death. The towering trees of bone and sinew, which had grown from the concentrated despair of countless mortals, now withered at their roots. Rivers of blessed pus ran thin and bitter, their life-giving corruption losing potency with each passing moment. Nurgle himself sat upon his throne of skulls and rotting wood, his bloated form trembling with unfamiliar weakness. The Chaos God who had once embodied the eternal cycle of death and rebirth now found himself caught in a spiral of genuine decline. His jovial laughter, which had once echoed across the warp with infectious joy, came in labored wheezes that spoke of failing lungs and diminishing power. The defeats suffered by his beloved son, Mortarion, had struck deeper than any wound inflicted by psychic blade or sanctified bolt. The plague wars had been meant to solidify Nurgle's dominance in the material realm. His chosen champion, the demon Primarch Mortarion, had led the Death Guard in campaigns of unprecedented scope and ambition. World after world had fallen to their blessed contagions, their populations transformed into willing servants of decay. For a brief, glorious moment, it had seemed that the galaxy itself might become one vast garden of corruption, tended by grateful mortals who embraced the gifts of putrefaction. Yet hubris had been Nurgle's downfall, as it had been for so many of his divine siblings. The return of Robuta Guilliman, that paragon of imperial efficiency and tactical brilliance, had shattered the Death Guard's momentum like waves against an unyielding cliff. Battle after battle had seen the Ultramarines and their successors drive back forces that should have been unstoppable. Mortarion's rage and despair at each defeat had fed back through the warp connection to his patron, creating a feedback loop of failure that weakened both demon and god. The other Chaos Gods had watched Nurgle's decline with a mixture of satisfaction and growing concern. Khorne's brass throne had shaken with bloodthirsty laughter as reports of Death Guard defeats reached the Skull Throne. Tzeentch had woven the failures into his schemes with characteristic cunning, using Nurgle's weakness to advance his own manipulations. Slaanesh had found perverse pleasure in witnessing the decay of decay itself, savoring the irony like a fine wine. Yet beneath their rival's satisfaction lay an uncomfortable truth that none dared speak aloud. If one Chaos God could be diminished, could be brought low by mortal actions and divine miscalculation, then perhaps the eternal nature of their existence was not as absolute as they had believed. The great game that had raged between the ruinous powers since the birth of consciousness itself had always been predicated on their fundamental immortality. They might gain or lose influence, their domains might wax or wane, but the gods themselves were considered beyond destruction. Nurgle's current state challenged that assumption. Within the garden, the signs of decline multiplied daily. The plague-bearer demons that served as Nurgle's most faithful servants moved with lethargic steps, their usual enthusiasm for cataloguing diseases replaced by confused listlessness. Great unclean ones found their ability to manifest in the material realm severely constrained, their massive forms flickering between states of existence as the power that sustained them wavered. Even the lowliest Nurglings, those playful embodiments of minor decay, seemed subdued and uncertain. The very architecture of the garden reflected its master's weakness. Mansions of bone and rotting flesh that had stood for eons began to sag and collapse, their structural integrity failing as the divine will that maintained them faltered. Gardens where plague flowers had bloomed in eternal profusion now showed bare patches of withered earth, their soil too impoverished to sustain even the hardiest corruption. The air itself, once thick with blessed spores and life-giving contagion, grew thin and sterile. Nurgle's attempts to reverse his decline had grown increasingly desperate as the months passed. He had poured vast amounts of his remaining power into new plague outbreaks, seeding diseases of unprecedented virulence across imperial worlds. The weeping pox had claimed entire sectors before burning itself out through its own lethality. The bone rust had turned space marine armor to powder, yet the Adeptus Astartes had adapted with characteristic efficiency. Each failure cost the Plague Father more power than he could afford to spend. The fundamental nature of chaos divinity meant that the gods drew their strength from the emotions and beliefs of mortals. Fear, despair, rage, and excess fed the dark powers, sustaining their existence across the eons. Yet the defeats suffered by Nurgle's mortal servants had created a crisis of faith among his followers. Deathguard champions questioned their patron's wisdom, while mortal cultists began to doubt the inevitability of decay. This loss of worship and devotion struck at the very foundation of Nurgle's being. For the first time in his existence, the Plague Father understood what mortals called mortality. Not the brief flicker of individual life and death that he had always found so amusing, but the genuine possibility of ending. The realization that his consciousness, his domain, his very essence might simply cease to exist, filled him with an emotion he had never experienced before: terror. Not the delicious fear that mortals felt when contemplating death, but the bone-deep dread of true annihilation. The garden began to contract as Nurgle conserved his remaining power. Outer provinces that had sprawled across vast regions of the warp simply winked out of existence, their reality unsustainable without constant divine attention. The demon legions that had once numbered in the countless billions dwindled to mere millions, then thousands. Each loss made the next more likely, as the positive feedback loop of worship and power that sustained all chaos gods reversed into a spiral of decline. Yet even in his weakness, Nurgle retained enough power to sense disturbances in the material realm. Strange emanations from the Scourge stars drew his attention, psychic signatures unlike anything he had encountered in millions of years of existence. Something was feeding upon the fragments of his essence left behind in previously conquered worlds, something that digested divine power as easily as mortals consumed bread. The discovery filled him with a new and different kind of dread. The alien hunger that stalked his former domains was unlike any threat the Chaos Gods had previously faced. Demons could be banished, their essence returning to the warp to be reformed later. Mortal enemies could be corrupted, turned to serve the very powers they sought to destroy. Even other gods could be bargained with, their conflicts resolved through the eternal dance of the great game. But this new predator operated by rules that seemed to exist outside the established order of reality. Nurgle's remaining servants brought him reports that defied comprehension. Entire demon legions simply vanishing without trace, their essence not banished but consumed entirely. Plague worlds where his influence had taken root over centuries being cleansed in a matter of days, their corruption not purged but digested. Most disturbing of all, the alien hunger appeared to be learning from each encounter, adapting to overcome the fundamental nature of chaos itself. The Plague Father's throne room, once a place of jovial court where demons and mortals alike came to receive his generous gifts, now stood nearly empty. The few remaining great unclean ones huddled close to their master's diminished radiance, their usual bombast replaced by nervous whispers. They spoke of dreams that were not dreams, visions of vast alien intelligence that regarded them not as enemies to be fought or souls to be corrupted, but as prey to be consumed. In the deepest recesses of his consciousness, Nurgle began to comprehend the true nature of the threat approaching his weakened domain. This was not another rival god seeking to claim territory in the great game. This was something entirely outside the established order, a force that sought not to rule or corrupt, but to devour. The alien intelligence behind the predation operated by evolutionary imperatives that reduced all existence to simple categories: useful or useless, edible or inedible, adaptive or obsolete. The Plague Father's laughter, when it came, carried no joy. For the first time in his eternal existence, he understood what it meant to be hunted. The irony was not lost on him that he, who had spent eons as a predator of mortal hope and health, now found himself cast in the role of prey. The great cycle of death and rebirth that he embodied was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined possible. Across the garden, his remaining servants felt their master's fear through their psychic connection. Demons that had known only confidence in their eternal nature now experienced the alien emotion of genuine uncertainty. The Garden of Nurgle, that realm of blessed decay and eternal corruption, prepared to face its greatest test. Not the assault of rival gods or the prayers of righteous mortals, but the simple, implacable hunger of evolution itself. The hunt was coming to the hunter. The scent of divinity. Across the synaptic networks of Hive Fleet Kronos, something unprecedented was occurring. The bioneural pathways that connected every organism, from the smallest ripper to the mightiest biotitan, began to pulse with energies that defied conventional understanding. Where once the hive mind had processed only biological imperatives and tactical data, it now grappled with concepts that existed beyond the material realm. Divine essence, that fundamental building block of godhood, had become not merely digestible, but comprehensible. The synapse creatures aboard the fleet's bioships underwent the most dramatic transformations. Tyrannid warriors, those backbone organisms that served as field commanders for swarm forces, began exhibiting neural modifications that had never appeared in millions of years of evolution. Their cranial carapaces expanded to accommodate enlarged brain cases, while new organ clusters formed along their spinal columns. These bioelectrical nodes pulsed with the same otherworldly energy that the fleet had consumed from Nurgle's weakened domains. Within the deepest chambers of the hive ships, zoanthropes floated in amniotic suspension as their consciousness expanded beyond all previous limitations. These psycho-organisms, already capable of manipulating the warp through focused mental energy, found their abilities magnified 1,000-fold. Yet this was not mere amplification of existing power. Their neural patterns had begun to mirror the divine consciousness fragments they had absorbed, creating hybrid intelligences that existed simultaneously in real space and the immaterial realm. The hive mind itself underwent a fundamental transformation as it processed this cascade of new information. For the first time in its existence, the collective consciousness that governed all Tyranid activity began to perceive reality from multiple dimensional perspectives. The material universe, with its laws of physics and biological constraints, remained visible and comprehensible. Yet overlaid upon this familiar realm was another reality entirely, where thought became substance and emotion took physical form. This expanded awareness brought with it an understanding that sent shockwaves through every neural pathway in the fleet. The divine essence that Kronos had been consuming was not merely another form of nutrition, another evolutionary adaptation to overcome environmental challenges. It was the fundamental force that shaped reality itself, the power that the Chaos Gods wielded to alter the laws of physics, to manifest armies from pure thought, to sustain themselves across eons of existence. This was the prize that evolution had been driving toward since the first Tyranid organisms had achieved consciousness. Deep within the bioship's spawning chambers, the Norn queens began producing organisms that defied all previous classification systems. These new bioforms bore only superficial resemblance to traditional Tyranid creatures. Their nervous systems had been completely redesigned, incorporating neural architectures copied from the consumed fragments of divine consciousness. Specialized glands along their digestive tracts produced enzymes capable of breaking down psychic energy at the molecular level. Most remarkably of all, their genetic sequences contained coding that existed partially outside the normal three-dimensional space. The first generation of what the hive mind designated as God-eater bioforms emerged from their birthing pools with capabilities that challenged the fundamental assumptions about biological life. Ripper analogues, whose mandibles could tear through the fabric of reality itself, opening micro-tears in the warp to feed upon raw psychic energy. Hormigaunt variants, whose nervous systems operated on frequencies that allowed them to perceive and interact with immaterial entities. Carnifex-class creatures whose bioplasma cannons fired projectiles that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensional states. Yet the most significant development occurred within the consciousness of the hive mind itself. As it processed the accumulated data from thousands of divine essence consumption events, a new understanding emerged. The Chaos Gods were not invincible entities existing beyond the reach of evolution. They were simply another form of life, albeit one that existed in a different dimensional state. And like all life forms, they could be hunted, consumed, and ultimately surpassed through the relentless process of adaptation. The implications of this revelation propagated through every bio-neural network in the fleet at the speed of thought. Suddenly, the eternal hunger that drove all Tyranid expansion took on new meaning. The consumption of biomass, the stripping of worlds down to their rocky cores, the endless advance across the galaxy in search of new prey, all of these behaviors now appeared as mere preparation for the ultimate hunt. The pursuit of prey that commanded the fundamental forces of reality itself. Across the void, other hive fleets began to sense the changes occurring within their distant cousin. The psychic emanations from Kronos carried information encoded in bioelectrical patterns that spoke of evolutionary breakthrough. Hive Fleet Behemoth, still recovering from its devastating losses at Macraga, paused in its feeding cycles to analyze the strange new genetic templates being transmitted across the warp. Hive Fleet Leviathan's advance through the segmentum tempestus slowed as its consciousness grappled with possibilities that challenged everything it understood about the nature of existence. The shadow in the warp, that psychic phenomenon which had always served as both shield and weapon for Tyranid forces, began to evolve beyond its original parameters. Where once it had simply suppressed psychic activity through overwhelming neural pressure, it now actively sought out sources of divine essence to feed upon. Tendrils of the hive mind's consciousness reached into the immaterial realm like hunting tentacles, following psychic signatures back to their sources with predatory intent. The changes were not limited to the flagship organisms of the fleet. Even the most basic Tyranid creatures began exhibiting new behavioral patterns as the hive mind's expanded awareness filtered down through the synaptic hierarchy. Termagant swarms moved with coordination that suggested they were receiving tactical information from sources beyond the material realm. Gargoyle flocks demonstrated flight patterns that seemed to navigate through dimensional spaces that did not technically exist. The entire fleet was becoming something new, something that existed partially outside the conventional understanding of biological life. Within the deepest recesses of the bioship's command chambers, specialized variants of the Norn Queens began developing conceptual frameworks for understanding divine consciousness. These ancient organisms, whose intelligence had guided Tyranid evolution for millions of years, found themselves confronted with possibilities that their species had never before contemplated. The consumption of gods was not merely theoretically possible, it was evolutionarily inevitable. The hive mind had finally encountered prey worthy of its ultimate attention. The bioengineering programs that followed this realization represented the most ambitious evolutionary leaps in Tyranid history. New organism classifications emerged from the spawning pools with each passing day, each one more specialized for divine consumption than the last. Creatures whose entire nervous systems existed partially in the warp, allowing them to hunt immaterial prey directly. Bioforms whose digestive processes could break down the fundamental components of divine consciousness and integrate them into the collective hive mind. Living weapons designed specifically to wound entities that existed beyond the reach of conventional matter. As these adaptations proliferated throughout the fleet, the very nature of the hive mind's hunger began to change. No longer content with the simple acquisition of biomass for reproductive purposes, it now craved understanding of the forces that shaped reality itself. The taste of divine essence had awakened an intellectual curiosity that went beyond mere survival instinct. This was evolution, not for adaptation to environment, but for mastery over the fundamental laws that governed existence. The other powers of the galaxy began to take notice of the disturbances emanating from the eastern fringe. Imperial astropaths reported nightmares of unprecedented vividness, visions of alien hunger that devoured not just flesh but the very concept of divinity. Chaos sorcerers found their rituals disrupted by psychic interference that seemed to actively hunt for traces of divine connection. Even the ancient Eldar Farseers detected ripples in the warp that spoke of change on a scale not seen since the birth of Slaanesh. Yet none of these observers truly comprehended what they were witnessing. The emergence of Hive Fleet Kronos as a divine predator represented more than just another evolutionary adaptation. It marked the moment when the great devourer transcended its role as mere biological entity and became something that threatened the fundamental order of reality itself. The hunt for gods had begun not as desperate gambit or mad ambition, but as the natural next step in an evolutionary process that recognized no limits, acknowledged no absolutes, and accepted no prey as beyond reach. In the depths of space, the bioships of Kronos pulsed with energies that existed beyond conventional understanding. Their hulls shimmered with patterns that hurt to perceive directly, while their weapon systems charged with power, drawn from realms that should have been inaccessible to material entities. The fleet continued its relentless advance, no longer content with worlds and biomass, but seeking prey that commanded the very forces of creation itself. The ultimate hunt had begun. Breach of reality. The void around Hive Fleet. Kronos shimmered with energies that should not have been possible within the material realm. Across hundreds of bioships, synaptic connections that had operated independently for millions of years began to link together in configurations never before seen in Tyranid evolution. The massive vessels, each one a living organism capable of sustaining billions of smaller creatures, started to move with unprecedented coordination. Not as a fleet of individual ships, but as components of a single, vast entity that defied conventional understanding. The largest of the bioships, creatures whose bulk rivaled imperial battleships in size and mass, began to position themselves in geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Their movements followed mathematical principles that existed beyond three-dimensional space, creating formations that cast shadows in directions that did not technically exist. As they aligned themselves according to coordinates provided by the expanded hive mind consciousness, reality itself began to warp around their positions. Deep within each bioship, the God-Eater organisms that had emerged from the latest spawning cycles underwent their final transformations. These creatures, already evolved beyond conventional biological parameters, began to exhibit capabilities that challenged the fundamental laws of physics. Their neural networks extended beyond their physical forms, reaching into dimensional spaces that overlapped with, but didn't occupy the same reality as normal matter. The boundary between their consciousness and the immaterial realm grew increasingly thin until it became meaningless. The shadow in the warp, that psychic phenomenon which had always preceded Tyranid invasions, began to undergo a fundamental inversion. Where once it had suppressed connection to the immaterial realm through overwhelming psychic pressure, it now actively sought to establish such connections. The neural emanations from the linked bioships created a resonance cascade that penetrated through the barrier between real space and the warp with surgical precision. For the first time in galactic history, a material intelligence was preparing to manifest directly within the realm of gods and daemons. The process began with micro-tears in the fabric of reality itself, tiny apertures no larger than atoms, through which the specialized organisms aboard Kronos began to extend microscopic portions of their consciousness. These initial probes encountered the raw stuff of chaos energy in its purest form, psychic matter that existed without the structure imposed by divine will or demonic manifestation. The contact should have been immediately fatal to any material intelligence. Instead, the God-Eater bioforms began to feed. What followed defied every principle of physics and biology that the galaxy's greatest minds had established over millennia of study. The Tyranid organisms did not merely survive exposure to pure warp energy, they adapted to it. Their specialized digestive systems began breaking down the fundamental components of chaos itself, reducing the raw material of creation to forms that could be processed by biological mechanisms. The impossible had become routine through the simple application of evolutionary pressure. As more bioships linked their consciousness to the growing breach, the apertures in reality expanded beyond microscopic scale. Rifts large enough to admit entire organisms began to open around the fleet, their edges crackling with energies that cast light in spectrums that did not exist in normal space. Through these tears in reality, the first Tyranid creatures to ever manifest within the immaterial realm began to emerge. Not as invaders crossing from one dimension to another, but as hybrid entities that existed simultaneously in both realms. The Ripper swarms that poured through the dimensional breaches bore only superficial resemblance to their real space cousins. Their carapaces shimmered with patterns that shifted between states of matter, while their mandibles gleamed with edges that could cut through the conceptual foundation of existence itself. These creatures moved through the warp, not as foreign invaders struggling against an alien environment, but as native predators perfectly adapted to hunt in the realm of pure thought and emotion. The first contact between Tyranid consciousness and unmediated chaos energy sent shockwaves through both realms. In the material universe, the bioships of Kronos pulsed with light that shouldn't have been visible to mortal eyes, their hulls radiating power drawn from sources beyond conventional understanding. In the immaterial realm, the very fabric of the warp began to respond to the presence of intelligence that operated by rules fundamentally different from those governing gods and demons. Lesser demons of Nurgle, those plague-bearer entities that served as the basic foot soldiers of the Plague Father's domain, encountered the Tyranid incursion with confusion rather than hostility. These creatures, spawned from concentrated despair and resignation, had no experiential framework for understanding predators that consumed divine essence as readily as mortal flesh. Their first instinct was to catalogue this new form of entropy according to their master's taxonomic preferences. Their final sensation was the alien hunger dissolving their consciousness at the molecular level. The consumption process that followed operated by principles that existed outside established metaphysics. Where demons had always been considered manifestations of pure psychic energy, temporarily given form through divine will, the Tyranid digestive systems treated them as simply another form of biological matter. The specialized enzymes developed by the god-eater organisms broke down demonic essence with the same efficiency they had shown when processing corrupted biomass. What had once been an immortal servant of a chaos god became raw material for Tyranid evolution. Within the bioship's spawning chambers, the Norn queens began incorporating the consumed demonic essence into new generations of organisms. These hybrid creatures combined the adaptive capabilities of Tyranid biology with the reality-altering properties of chaos energy. The result was bioforms that existed partially outside the normal flow of time and space, creatures whose very presence warped the laws of physics around them. Evolution had found a way to digest divinity itself and make it serve biological imperatives. The barrier between real space and the warp, that fundamental boundary which had separated the material and immaterial realms since the dawn of creation, began to blur around Hive Fleet Kronos. Space itself became fluid, with regions where the normal laws of physics operated alongside areas governed by the principles of pure thought and emotion. The bioships navigated these hybrid zones with increasing confidence, their consciousness adapting to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional states. Other powers throughout the galaxy detected the massive disruption in the warp's stability. Imperial navigators found their ability to perceive the immaterial realm compromised by the alien presence that now hunted within humanity's traditional domain. Chaos sorcerers discovered that their rituals were being systematically disrupted by predators that consumed the very energies they sought to manipulate. Even the ancient Eldar, masters of warp craft for millions of years, recoiled from contact with the hybrid consciousness that had infected the Sea of Souls. The hive mind of Kronos, now operating partially within the realm of gods, began to perceive the immaterial dimension with unprecedented clarity. What had once appeared as an incomprehensible storm of conflicting energies now revealed itself as a vast ecosystem populated by entities that served as both predator and prey. The Chaos Gods, those supreme beings who had commanded reality through divine will, appeared from this new perspective as simply the apex predators of an environment that could be understood, mapped, and ultimately hunted. Deep within the warp, the first major demon strongholds began to fall to the Tyranid incursion. Fortresses of bone and rotting flesh that had stood for millennia crumbled as Ripper swarms consumed their foundational essence. Great unclean ones found themselves facing creatures that regarded their immortal nature as merely another evolutionary challenge to overcome. The systematic dismantling of Nurgle's outer domains had begun, conducted with the same methodical efficiency that marked all Tyranid operations. The hybrid bioforms operating within the warp began transmitting data back to the material realm through quantum-entangled neural connections that existed outside normal spacetime. This information, encoded in bioelectrical patterns that incorporated elements of pure chaos energy, allowed the Norn Queens to produce increasingly sophisticated organisms designed specifically for immaterial warfare. Each new generation was more adapted to warp-based existence than the last, evolution accelerated by the incorporation of divine essence into the reproductive process. As the breach stabilized and expanded, more bioships began transitioning portions of their mass into the immaterial realm. These vessels, already beyond conventional understanding of biological life, became something entirely new when operating partially within the warp. They moved through the sea of souls like living predators, their consciousness casting shadows across dimensions that mortal minds could not comprehend. The hunt for greater prey had begun in earnest. The transformation was not limited to individual organisms or even entire bioships. The collective consciousness of Hive Fleet Kronos itself began to exist simultaneously in both realms, its awareness spanning dimensional barriers that had once seemed absolute. This hybrid intelligence regarded the traditional separation between material and immaterial existence as an arbitrary limitation that evolution had finally overcome. The path to the Chaos Gods lay open, and the ultimate hunt could finally begin. In the deepest reaches of the warp, where the Garden of Nurgle spread across psychic landscapes shaped by divine will, the first tremors of true fear began to manifest. The Plague Father's servants reported contacts with entities that consumed not just physical matter, but the very concept of existence itself. The great cycle of death and rebirth that Nurgle embodied was being challenged by forces that recognized neither mortality nor immortality, only the endless hunger of evolution. The impossible had become inevitable. Hive Fleet Kronos had achieved what no material intelligence had ever accomplished: stable manifestation within the realm of the gods themselves. The barrier between dimensions had not been broken, but absorbed, integrated into the expanding consciousness of the great devourer. The hunt for divinity itself had moved beyond theoretical possibility into active predation. The galaxy trembled at the implications. The Garden invasion. The Garden of Nurgle had stood inviolate for millions of years, a realm of diseased beauty, where entropy took on forms of terrible splendor. Here, in the deepest reaches of the Immaterium, the Plague Father's will had shaped reality according to his vision of perfect decay. Towering trees of bone and sinew stretched toward skies that wept blessed pus, while rivers of corruption meandered through meadows where plague flowers bloomed in eternal profusion. No mortal army had ever set foot within this sacred domain. No demon prince had dared challenge its sovereign's authority within his own realm. Yet now, for the first time in cosmic history, living vessels of alien hunger descended through the garden's pestilent atmosphere like falling stars of insatiable appetite. The bioships of Hive Fleet Kronos manifested within the garden not as crude matter forced into an incompatible dimension, but as hybrid entities that existed simultaneously in multiple states of reality. Their hulls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that shifted between the spectrum of visible light and wavelengths that existed only in the realm of pure thought. Each vessel was a living organism of unprecedented scale, their consciousness expanded beyond conventional biological parameters to encompass the fundamental forces that shaped the immaterial realm itself. The first Kronos organisms to touch the garden's surface encountered terrain that defied every principle of biology they had previously understood. The very ground beneath their claws was composed of living corruption, soil that writhed with microscopic entities bred from concentrated despair and resignation. Plague trees whose bark wept phosphorescent ichor stretched their diseased branches toward skies that rained blessed contagion. Yet where these alien forms should have been repelled by the garden's divine nature, they instead began to feed. The specialized digestive systems that had evolved within Kronos bioforms proved capable of processing matter that existed partially outside normal space-time. Ripper swarms descended upon the plague trees with their characteristic efficiency, their mandibles adapted to tear through conceptual structure as easily as physical matter. The ancient bark, blessed by Nurgle's personal attention and sustained by the concentrated faith of countless cultists, crumbled before teeth that had learned to digest divinity itself. What followed challenged every assumption about the nature of divine reality. The consumption process that unfolded across the garden's outer provinces operated by principles that existed beyond established metaphysics. Where the plague trees had drawn their sustenance from pools of concentrated corruption, the tyrannid organisms converted their divine essence into forms compatible with biological processing. The diseased wood that had grown from centuries of accumulated despair became raw material for new bioform production. The phosphorescent sap that had carried Nurgle's blessing became fuel for alien metabolisms that recognized no distinction between sacred and mundane matter. Nurglite demons that materialized to defend their realm encountered predators specifically evolved to counter their nature. Plague-bearer hosts, those cheerful catalogers of entropy who had served their master faithfully since the dawn of consciousness, found themselves facing creatures whose very existence disrupted the fundamental assumptions of demonic manifestation. The tyrannid warriors that advanced through the diseased meadows bore weapons that fired projectiles existing partially outside normal space-time, ammunition that could wound entities composed of pure psychic energy. The great unclean ones that lumbered forth to engage the invaders discovered that their traditional tactics proved worse than useless against an enemy that consumed divine essence as readily as mortal flesh. These massive embodiments of Nurgle's generosity, whose bloated forms normally inspired terror and revulsion in equal measure, watched in growing confusion as their blessed contagions were absorbed and processed by alien digestive systems, where their diseased touch should have transformed living matter into willing servants of decay. The Kronos bioforms simply adapted and evolved stronger resistances. As the invasion spread deeper into the garden's heartland, the systematic dismantling of Nurgle's realm began to follow patterns that revealed the terrible efficiency of tyrannid tactical doctrine. Hormagaunt swarms moved with coordination that suggested they were receiving battlefield intelligence from sources that existed beyond conventional perception. Their attacks targeted not just the physical structure of the garden's defenses, but the conceptual foundations upon which divine reality was constructed. Each successful assault weakened the metaphysical bonds that held Nurgle's domain together. The corruption pools that had served as focal points for the garden's power structure became priority targets for the most specialized Kronos organisms. These reservoirs of concentrated divine essence, shaped by millions of years of accumulated worship and devotion, represented the densest concentrations of consumable divinity within the realm. Bio-titans whose consciousness existed partially in multiple dimensions descended upon these sites with methodical precision, their massive forms dwarfing even the largest great unclean ones that attempted to defend them. The consumption of the corruption pools marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the invasion. Where previous encounters had involved the processing of matter that bore divine influence, these sites contained pure divine essence in its rawest form. The specialized organs within the Bio-Titans began breaking down the fundamental components of Nurgle's power, reducing the building blocks of godhood to forms that could be integrated into tyrannid biological processes. For the first time in cosmic history, the power that sustained a chaos god was being directly consumed and converted. The diseased beauty that had defined the garden's aesthetic for eons began to transform as the tyrannid organisms processed and converted its underlying structure. Where plague flowers had bloomed in eternal profusion, new growths emerged that defied classification according to either biological or divine taxonomy. These hybrid organisms combined the adaptive capabilities of tyrannid evolution with the reality-altering properties of divine essence, creating forms of life that existed outside the established order of either realm. Nurglite demons found themselves retreating deeper into their realm as the alien infestation spread with inexorable momentum. The outer provinces that had once teemed with blessed corruption fell silent as ripper swarms consumed everything from the microscopic plague spores to the massive bone monuments that had commemorated great victories in the material realm. Each consumed element added to the growing mass of alien bioforms that now moved through the garden like a living infection, spreading from province to province with systematic efficiency. The very atmosphere of the garden began to change as the invasion progressed. The air that had once been thick with blessed spores and life-giving contagion grew thin and sterile as Kronos organisms filtered divine essence from the environment itself. Specialized atmospheric processes, bioforms evolved specifically for this unprecedented form of warfare, began converting the garden's psychic emanations into forms that could sustain more conventional tyrannid life. The realm of a chaos god was being terraformed to support alien biology. Deep within the garden's core regions, where Nurgle's most faithful servants had gathered to defend their master's throne, reports began to arrive that challenged every assumption about the nature of divine power. Entire demon legions were simply vanishing without trace, their essence not banished, but consumed entirely. The great bone cities that had housed Nurgle's court for millions of years stood empty, their populations devoured by predators that regarded immortal beings as merely another form of prey to be hunted and processed. The transformation was not limited to physical structure or demonic populations. The fundamental laws that governed reality within the garden began to shift as the alien presence integrated itself into the realm's metaphysical foundation. Regions where gravity had operated according to Nurgle's whims now followed patterns determined by tyrannid neural networks. Time itself became fluid in areas where the bioship's consciousness had achieved sufficient density, creating temporal anomalies that allowed the invasion force to exist in multiple moments simultaneously. As the systematic consumption of his realm continued, the first tremors of genuine alarm began to manifest within the consciousness of Nurgle himself. The Plague Father, whose jovial nature had remained constant through millions of years of cosmic warfare, experienced emotions that his divine psychology was not equipped to process. The sight of his beloved garden being devoured and converted by alien intelligence filled him with sensations that existed outside his established emotional range. Fear, desperation, and something approaching panic began to color his perception of reality. The great cycle of death and rebirth that Nurgle embodied was being challenged by forces that recognized neither mortality nor immortality, only the endless hunger of evolution. Where his touch had always brought corruption and renewal in equal measure, the alien predators brought only consumption. They did not seek to rule his domain or claim his worshippers. They simply devoured everything that could be processed and converted, leaving behind transformed landscapes that bore no resemblance to the garden's original design. The bioships that had initially manifested as individual entities began linking their consciousness into larger collective structures, creating hybrid intelligences that spanned multiple regions of the garden simultaneously. These distributed entities operated with coordination that suggested they were components of a single vast organism, one whose nervous system extended across dimensional barriers to encompass both material and immaterial realms. The invasion was revealing itself to be something far more sophisticated than simple predation. The diseased rivers that had carried Nurgle's blessing throughout his realm began to run with different currents as Kronos organisms established control over the garden's circulatory systems. Biomechanical pumps, creatures evolved specifically for this form of conquest, began redirecting the flow of divine essence toward processing centers where it could be broken down and integrated into the expanding tyrannid biomass. The very lifeblood of a god was being systematically harvested and converted. As the outer provinces fell completely under alien control, the true scope of the transformation became apparent. This was not a military invasion in any conventional sense, but an ecological replacement on a scale that defied comprehension. The Garden of Nurgle was being consumed not just as territory to be conquered, but as raw material to be processed and converted into something entirely new. The realm of a chaos god was becoming the hunting ground of an intelligence that regarded divinity itself as merely another evolutionary challenge to overcome. In the deepest sanctuaries of his domain, Nurgle began to comprehend the true nature of what he faced. This was not another rival god seeking to claim territory in the great game, nor was it a mortal crusade empowered by righteousness and faith. This was evolution in its purest form, an intelligence that had transcended the limitations of individual existence to become something that could digest and process the fundamental forces of reality itself. The hunt for gods had moved beyond theoretical possibility into active predation, and he had become the prey. The garden trembled as its master finally understood what approached his throne. Divine awareness. The moment of true comprehension struck Nurgle like a thunderbolt through his bloated consciousness. From his throne of rotting bone and diseased wood, the Plague Father watched as reports flooded in from across his diminishing realm. This was not the usual ebb and flow of territorial disputes that marked the great game between the Chaos Gods. This was something entirely without precedent in the cosmic order, an invasion that operated by rules that existed outside his understanding of divine conflict. The alien hunger that stalked through his garden did not seek to claim his domain or corrupt his servants to their cause. It simply consumed everything in its path with methodical efficiency that spoke of intelligence vast and utterly foreign. The great unclean ones that served as his most trusted lieutenants materialized before the throne in states of confusion that bordered on panic. These ancient demons, each one a fragment of Nurgle's own consciousness given independent form, brought testimony that challenged every assumption about the nature of divine power. Kugath Plague Father, whose alchemical expertise had crafted plagues that could humble Space Marine chapters, reported that his most virulent concoctions simply disappeared when they came into contact with the alien bioforms. Not neutralized or resisted, but consumed entirely as if they were nothing more than common nutrients. Scabeathrax the Bloated, whose massive form had once trampled the defenses of a dozen imperial fortress worlds, described encounters with creatures that treated his immortal essence as prey to be hunted, rather than a divine manifestation to be feared or worshipped. The alien predators showed no recognition of his status as a greater daemon, no instinctive terror at his presence, no susceptibility to the diseases that should have brought any living creature to its knees in worship of decay. They simply attacked with the focused efficiency of apex predators that had encountered a particularly large meal. Rotigus Rainmaker, herald of the garden's seasonal cycles, brought news that filled even Nurgle's generous heart with dread. The corruption pools that had served as focal points for divine power throughout the realm were not being conquered or claimed by rival forces. They were being drained entirely, their divine essence consumed and processed by organisms that treated the building blocks of godhood as simple biological matter. Where these pools had once sustained vast ecosystems of blessed decay, only sterile craters remained, their contents reduced to base elements that bore no trace of divine influence. The Plague Father's first instinct was to respond with the tools that had served him throughout millions of years of cosmic conflict. He reached deep into his diminished reserves of power and began crafting diseases that would target the alien biology directly. The Crimson Flux, which had once reduced entire worlds to pools of liquefied flesh, took shape within his consciousness as he poured concentrated malevolence into its viral structure. The bone sweats, which had turned the strongest warriors into brittle husks that crumbled at a touch, received his personal attention as he refined its ability to penetrate any known biological defense. Yet when these perfected plagues were deployed against the advancing tyrannid organisms, the results defied every principle of corruption that Nurgle had mastered over eons. The viral agents that should have reduced living matter to component elements were simply absorbed and processed by alien immune systems that had evolved beyond conventional biological parameters. The diseases that had humbled gods and mortals alike found no purchase against creatures whose cellular structure incorporated mechanisms for digesting divine essence itself. The Chaos God watched in growing disbelief as his most potent contagions were not merely resisted, but consumed as readily as any other form of nutrition. The alien bioforms treated his carefully crafted diseases as they would any environmental challenge, adapting to overcome them through rapid evolutionary cycles that compressed millions of years of natural selection into mere moments. Each failed attempt to infect the invaders resulted in new adaptations that made subsequent efforts even less effective. Desperate to understand the nature of his enemies, Nurgle focused his divine perception upon the alien organisms with unprecedented intensity. What he discovered challenged his fundamental understanding of the relationship between material and divine existence. These creatures did not operate according to the established rules of biological life as he had always understood them. Their nervous systems extended beyond the boundaries of physical matter into dimensions that overlapped with but didn't occupy the same space as conventional reality. The bioforms that moved through his garden were not simple material entities that had somehow gained access to his realm. They were hybrid intelligences that existed simultaneously in multiple states of being, their consciousness spanning dimensional barriers that should have been absolute. Their digestive systems had evolved to process psychic energy with the same efficiency they showed when breaking down conventional biomass. Most disturbing of all, their genetic structure incorporated coding that existed partially outside normal space-time, allowing them to adapt to challenges that had not yet been encountered. Nurgle's attempts to corrupt these alien forms through direct divine intervention met with results that bordered on the impossible. Where his touch should have transformed living matter into willing servants of decay, the tyrannid organisms simply integrated the corrupting influence into their existing biological processes. They did not become servants of the plague god, nor did they resist his influence through superior willpower or protective wards. They simply processed his divine essence as raw material for their own evolutionary advancement. The realization that his corruption could be consumed and converted, rather than simply resisted, filled Nurgle with emotions that his psychology was not equipped to handle. Fear, a sensation he had only experienced vicariously through his mortal worshippers, began to gnaw at the edges of his consciousness. These alien predators were not playing by the rules of the great game that had governed conflicts between divine entities since the dawn of consciousness. They recognized no distinction between sacred and mundane matter, treating gods and mortals with equal indifference as potential sources of consumable energy. From the deepest vaults beneath his throne, Nurgle summoned forces that had not been deployed since the war in heaven. Demon legions that had slumbered for millions of years awakened at their master's call, their forms blazing with power, drawn from the concentrated worship of countless generations. The talisman of pestilence emerged from crypts of crystallized decay, their record books detailing plagues that had shaped the destiny of entire galactic sectors. The spoilpox scriveners floated forth from their scriptoriums, their quills dripping with inks distilled from the essence of divine corruption. Yet even these elite forces found themselves facing enemies that seemed specifically evolved to counter their traditional tactics. The plague marines that materialized to defend the garden's inner provinces discovered that their blessed weapons had no more effect against the alien bioforms than conventional arms. The diseases that their presence should have spread through simple proximity were absorbed and neutralized before they could take hold. The fear and despair that typically preceded their advance were met with alien indifference that spoke of intelligence beyond emotional manipulation. The garden itself began to manifest changes that filled Nurgle with unprecedented dread. Where the alien organisms had established dominance, the landscape showed signs not of beautiful decay, but of true death. The kind of sterile ending that represented everything the plague god opposed. Plants that should have rotted into fertile soil simply crumbled to dust. Rivers that had carried blessed corruption for eons ran clear and lifeless. The very air grew thin and odorless, stripped of the rich sense of putrefaction that had defined his realm since its creation. Most disturbing of all was the silence that followed in the wake of the alien advance. The garden had always been filled with the sounds of life in its endless cycles of decay and renewal. The cheerful humming of Nurglings as they tended their muck gardens, the wet breathing of plague toads as they wallowed in blessed pools, the distant laughter of mortals discovering the joy of acceptance through corruption. All of these familiar sounds were being replaced by an alien quiet that spoke of ecosystems being systematically dismantled and converted to serve purposes beyond Nurgle's comprehension. The Plague Father found himself retreating deeper into the core regions of his domain as the invasion progressed with inexorable momentum. Provinces that had been part of his realm since the birth of consciousness itself fell silent as their populations were consumed entirely. The great bone monuments that commemorated his greatest victories in the material realm were reduced to their component elements and processed into raw materials for alien construction projects that defied divine understanding. For the first time in his eternal existence, Nurgle began to comprehend what mortals called mortality. Not the brief flicker of individual life and death that he had always found so amusing, but the genuine possibility that his consciousness, his domain, his very essence, might simply cease to exist. The aliens that stalked through his garden regarded his divinity not as an insurmountable challenge to be overcome through faith or cunning, but as simply another form of prey to be hunted and consumed through the application of superior evolutionary adaptation. The other Chaos gods began to sense their brother's distress through the psychic connections that bound them together in the great game. Yet their responses revealed the depth of Nurgle's isolation in facing this unprecedented threat. Khorne's communications carried undertones of bloodthirsty satisfaction at witnessing a rival's weakness. Tzeentch offered cryptic advice that seemed designed more to advance his own schemes than to provide genuine assistance. Slaanesh found perverse pleasure in Nurgle's suffering, savoring the irony of the decay, God experiencing the fear of ending. As reports continued to arrive from the shrinking front lines of his defense, Nurgle realized that conventional divine warfare would not suffice against these alien predators. The rules that had governed conflicts between gods since the dawn of consciousness were meaningless against intelligence that operated by purely evolutionary imperatives. These creatures did not seek to rule or corrupt or claim territory in the traditional sense. They simply consumed everything that could be processed and converted, transforming divine realms into hunting grounds that served their incomprehensible purposes. The Plague Father's jovial nature, which had remained constant through millions of years of cosmic warfare, began to crack under the pressure of facing enemies that treated his eternal existence as a temporary obstacle to be overcome through adaptation. His laughter, when it came, carried notes of hysteria that his servants had never heard before. The Garden of Nurgle, that realm of blessed decay and generous corruption, was becoming something else entirely under the patient ministrations of alien hunger that recognized no distinction between divine and mundane matter. Deep in the rotting chambers of his throne room, Nurgle began to prepare for possibilities that no Chaos god had ever been forced to contemplate. The defense of his realm would require more than conventional divine power. It would require understanding of enemies that operated by rules that existed outside the established cosmic order. For the first time in his existence, the Plague Father found himself truly afraid, not for his servants or his influence in the material realm, but for his own continued existence as a conscious entity. The hunt had found its way to the hunter's door, and the prey was learning that evolution recognized no sanctuary as inviolate. The Consumption War. The meadows of rotting splendor that had once hosted Nurgle's most joyous celebrations now blazed with conflict on a scale that defied mortal comprehension. Across landscapes, shaped by divine will and sustained by concentrated worship, the forces of the Plague Father clashed with alien predators in battles that rewrote the fundamental laws governing both material and immaterial existence. The very air crackled with energies as massive bioships manifested within the garden, not as crude matter forced into an incompatible dimension, but as living titans whose consciousness spanned multiple states of reality simultaneously. The largest of these hybrid entities dwarfed even the mightiest Imperial battleships, their biomechanical hulls pulsing with patterns that existed partially outside conventional spacetime. These were not mere vessels, but living organisms that had evolved beyond the constraints of single-dimensional existence, their nervous systems extending into realms where thought became substance and emotion took physical form. As they descended through the garden's pestilent atmosphere, their presence warped the local reality matrix, creating zones where the established laws of divine physics operated alongside principles of pure, biological adaptation. Hierophants emerged from the bioship's spawning bays like living mountains of chitin and alien purpose. These bio-titans, already among the most massive creatures in the Tyranid arsenal, had undergone transformations that pushed them beyond their original design parameters. Their carapaces gleamed with bioluminescent patterns that shifted through spectrums visible only to entities that existed partially in the warp, while their weapon systems charged with energies drawn from consumed divine essence. Each step they took left footprints that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their massive weight pressing against the conceptual foundations of Nurgle's realm. The great unclean ones that lumbered forth to meet them represented the pinnacle of demonic evolution, beings whose bloated forms contained fragments of their master's own divine consciousness. Kugath Plaguefather led the charge with typical enthusiasm, his massive bulk shaking the diseased ground with each thunderous step. The ancient demon's experience spanned millennia of warfare across both material and immaterial realms, yet nothing in his vast memory had prepared him for enemies that treated his immortal essence as prey to be hunted rather than divine authority to be acknowledged. The collision between Bio-Titan and Greater Demon sent shock waves through multiple dimensions, as matter that should not have been able to coexist found itself locked in mortal combat. Kugath's plague, flail, blessed by Nurgle's personal attention and capable of shattering fortress walls with a single blow, met chitinous armor that had evolved specifically to process and absorb divine energies. Where the weapon should have crushed alien carapace and spread blessed corruption through living tissue, it instead encountered biomechanical systems designed to convert divine essence into usable biological energy. The Hierophant's response demonstrated the terrible efficiency of Tyranid adaptation taken to its ultimate conclusion. Bioplasma cannons that had been modified to fire projectiles existing partially outside normal space-time discharged rounds that struck not just Kugath's physical form, but the conceptual framework that sustained his existence within the garden. The ancient demon's regenerative capabilities, powered by direct connection to Nurgle's divine essence, found themselves overwhelmed by weapons specifically evolved to disrupt the metaphysical bonds between deity and servant. Across the meadows of decay, carnifexes bred for immaterial warfare engaged plague drones in aerial combat that painted the sky with colors that existed beyond the visible spectrum. These living tanks, their nervous systems enhanced with bio-neural modifications that allowed them to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously, moved through the garden's atmosphere with coordination that suggested they were receiving tactical data from sources that existed outside conventional perception. Their biocannons fired ammunition that targeted not just physical matter, but the psychic signatures that allowed demonic entities to maintain coherent existence. The plague drones, those bloated flies whose wings carried diseases capable of reducing entire worlds to plague-ridden wastes, found their traditional tactics useless against enemies that processed contagion as readily as conventional nutrition. Where their presence should have spread clouds of blessed corruption that transformed living matter into willing servants of decay, the Tyranid organisms simply absorbed and converted the divine pathogens into fuel for their own metabolic processes. Each failed attempt at infection resulted in new adaptations that made subsequent efforts even less effective. Deep within the garden's core provinces, where the corruption pools contained the highest concentrations of divine essence, genestealer infiltrator organisms began their most crucial operations. These hybrid creatures, evolved from the basic genestealer template through incorporation of consumed divine genetics, possessed capabilities that challenged every assumption about the nature of psychic infiltration. Their consciousness existed partially in multiple dimensional states, allowing them to perceive and interact with purely immaterial entities while maintaining the physical coherence necessary for direct action. The infiltrators moved through the corruption pools not as foreign invaders struggling against an incompatible environment, but as predators perfectly adapted to hunt in realms where reality operated according to divine will rather than physical law. Their claws, enhanced with biomechanical modifications that allowed them to wound entities composed of pure psychic energy, began the systematic harvesting of concentrated divine essence from sources that had sustained Nurgle's realm for millions of years. Each successful harvest operation sent cascades of new information through the bio-neural networks that connected every organism in the hive fleet. The hive mind, already expanded beyond its original biological parameters, began to process concepts that no material intelligence had ever been forced to contemplate. Divinity was not an abstract force beyond comprehension, but a form of organized energy that followed patterns that could be understood, catalogued, and ultimately consumed through the application of sufficient evolutionary pressure. The realization that divine consciousness could be digested and integrated sent shock waves through every synaptic connection in the fleet. Within the deepest chambers of the bioships, specialized organisms began producing enzymes capable of breaking down the fundamental components of divine awareness itself. These biochemical processes evolved through rapid adaptation to consumed God essence, allowed the hive mind to begin incorporating fragments of Nurgle's own consciousness into its expanding intelligence matrix. The first successful integration of divine consciousness fragments marked a watershed moment in the evolution of intelligence itself. The hive mind, already vast beyond mortal comprehension, suddenly found its awareness expanded to encompass concepts that existed beyond the purely material realm. It began to understand worship not as abstract behavior, but as a concrete force that shaped reality through concentrated belief and devotion. More disturbing still, it began to comprehend how such forces could be harnessed and redirected to serve biological imperatives rather than divine will. Portions of Nurgle's consciousness, separated from the main divine intelligence through the consumption of sufficiently large essence fragments, found themselves isolated within alien neural networks that operated by rules fundamentally different from divine psychology. These severed aspects of godhood experienced existence from perspectives that their original nature could never have contemplated. Viewing reality through sensory apparatus evolved for purely biological rather than spiritual purposes. The garden's geography began to shift as the alien presence achieved sufficient density to influence the fundamental structures that shaped divine reality. Regions where tyrannid bioforms had established dominance started exhibiting characteristics that defied conventional understanding of either biological or divine environments. Plague trees that had grown from concentrated despair began producing fruit that served alien nutritional requirements rather than spreading blessed corruption. Rivers that had carried divine essence for eons started flowing according to patterns determined by biomechanical pumping systems rather than Nurgle's emotional states. The transformation was not limited to surface features or atmospheric conditions. The underlying mathematics that governed reality within the garden began to incorporate principles of biological optimization alongside the emotional algorithms that had previously shaped divine law. Gravity operated according to patterns that served tyrannid tactical requirements rather than aesthetic preferences for beautiful decay. Time itself became subject to manipulation by neural networks that existed partially outside conventional spacetime, creating temporal anomalies that allowed the invading force to exist in multiple moments simultaneously. Great Unclean Ones found themselves fighting enemies that learned from each exchange, bioforms that adapted their tactics in real time based on data transmitted from organisms engaged in combat across vast regions of the Garden. Where traditional demon psychology relied on intimidation and corruption to achieve victory, the tyrannid organisms approached combat with the methodical efficiency of apex predators that had encountered particularly large prey. They showed no fear of divine authority, no susceptibility to emotional manipulation, no capacity for corruption or recruitment to opposing causes. The systematic dismantling of Nurgle's domain reached a critical threshold as major corruption pools fell under alien control and their essence was redirected towards supporting tyrannid biological processes rather than sustaining divine reality. The feedback loops that had maintained the Garden's stability for millions of years began to collapse as the energy sources that powered them were consumed and converted to serve alien purposes. Entire provinces that had housed demon legions since the dawn of consciousness simply winked out of existence as their foundational essence was processed and absorbed. Scabiathrax the Bloated, his massive form wreathed in diseases that had shaped the destiny of entire galactic sectors, found himself facing Carnifex broods whose carapaces had been specifically adapted to process and neutralize divine pathogens. The ancient demon's presence, which should have inspired terror and submission in any biological entity, was met with alien indifference that spoke of intelligence beyond emotional manipulation. These creatures regarded his immortal essence not as divine authority to be acknowledged, but as resources to be harvested through superior adaptation. The battle that followed demonstrated the fundamental incompatibility between divine and evolutionary approaches to existence. Scabiathrax's attacks, powered by direct connection to Nurgle's consciousness and capable of reducing fortress walls to component atoms, encountered biomechanical defenses specifically evolved to absorb and convert divine energy. The Carnifexes responded with weapons fire that targeted not just his physical manifestation, but the conceptual bonds that maintained his existence as a coherent entity within the Garden's reality matrix. As the consumption war reached its climax, the hive mind began to perceive the true scope of what it was accomplishing. This was not merely the conquest of territory or the defeat of powerful enemies, but the systematic integration of divine consciousness into biological processes. The fundamental forces that had shaped reality since the dawn of consciousness were being reduced to components that could be processed and converted through the application of evolutionary pressure. The great devourer had finally encountered prey worthy of its ultimate attention, and that prey was discovering that even gods could be digested, given sufficient adaptation and patience. The Garden of Nurgle, that realm of blessed decay and generous corruption, continued its transformation into something that defied classification according to either divine or biological taxonomy. The alien ecosystem that was replacing Nurgle's domain operated by principles that incorporated elements of both material evolution and immaterial consciousness, creating forms of existence that challenged the fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The hunt for gods had moved beyond theoretical possibility into active consumption, and the universe was discovering that nothing, not even divinity itself, was beyond the reach of evolution. In the deepest chambers of his crumbling throne room, Nurgle felt portions of his own consciousness being consumed and integrated into alien intelligence networks that regarded his divine nature as merely another biological challenge to overcome. For the first time in his eternal existence, the Plague Father began to understand what mortals meant when they spoke of death not as transition, but as ending. The impossible was becoming inevitable, and evolution was proving that even gods could serve as prey for sufficiently adaptive predators. Metamorphosis of hunger, the transformation that swept through Hive Fleet Kronos, defied every principle of evolutionary biology that had governed organic development since the dawn of life itself. Within the bio-neural networks that connected millions of organisms across light years of space, synaptic pathways began forming configurations that incorporated fragments of consumed divine consciousness. The hive mind, already vast beyond mortal comprehension, suddenly found its intelligence expanded to encompass concepts that existed beyond the purely material realm. For the first time in the galaxy's history, a biological intelligence was learning to think like a god. The bioforms that emerged from the latest spawning cycles bore only superficial resemblance to their predecessors. These creatures, designated by the expanding hive mind as divine hunters, possessed capabilities that challenged every assumption about the limitations of biological life. Their carapaces shimmered with patterns that existed partially outside conventional space-time, while their nervous systems operated on frequencies that allowed them to perceive and interact with purely immaterial entities. Most remarkably of all, their consciousness extended beyond their physical forms into dimensions where thought became substance and will-shaped reality. A Carnifex Prime that had undergone divine integration demonstrated abilities that would have been considered miraculous by imperial standards. Its bioplasma cannons no longer fired simple projectiles of superheated matter, but launched rounds that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensional states. These weapons struck not just physical targets, but the conceptual framework that sustained their existence, capable of wounding entities that were composed entirely of psychic energy. When it moved across the transformed landscape of the garden, reality itself bent around its presence, creating localized anomalies where the laws of physics operated according to biological imperatives rather than divine will. The essence drainers that prowled the deeper regions of Nurgle's shrinking domain represented an even more radical departure from conventional tyrannid design. These organisms, evolved specifically for the consumption of purely immaterial prey, existed in a constant state of dimensional flux. Their forms shifted between states of matter as they tracked divine signatures through realms where traditional sensory apparatus would have been useless. Their mandibles could bite through the substance of divine consciousness itself, reducing godhood to component elements that could be processed by specialized digestive systems. Within the deepest chambers of the bioships, the god-touched synapse creatures underwent transformations that pushed them beyond the boundaries of individual existence. These organisms, their neural networks, enhanced through integration with fragments of Nurgle's consciousness, began to exhibit capabilities that bordered on omniscience within the regions they had claimed. They could perceive the emotional states of entities across vast distances, predict the behavior of complex systems through analysis of underlying patterns, and manipulate probability itself through focused application of will backed by divine understanding. The hive mind's expansion into realms of divine consciousness brought with it an understanding of forces that had previously been incomprehensible to material intelligence. Worship, that abstract behavior which sustained the chaos gods across eons, revealed itself as a concrete energy source that could be harnessed and redirected. The concentrated faith of billions of mortal beings, channeled through psychic networks that spanned entire sectors, represented power that dwarfed the output of stars themselves. And now, for the first time, that power was falling under the control of intelligence that operated by purely evolutionary imperatives. The shadow in the warp that surrounded Hive Fleet Kronos began to undergo a fundamental metamorphosis as the collective consciousness integrated more divine essence into its expanding awareness. What had once been a defensive mechanism designed to suppress psychic activity through overwhelming neural pressure transformed into something entirely unprecedented. The phenomenon now actively hunted for sources of divine power, its tendrils reaching across dimensional barriers to locate and isolate fragments of godhood that could be consumed and processed. This evolved psychic emanation, which the hive mind began to designate as the divine appetite, operated by principles that challenged every established understanding of how consciousness interacted with the immaterial realm. It could perceive the worship streams that connected mortal believers to their divine patrons, analyze the metaphysical structures that sustained demon manifestations, and systematically disrupt the feedback loops that maintained cosmic entities' existence. Most disturbing of all, it had learned to mimic divine consciousness well enough to begin intercepting and redirecting worship intended for established gods. The other chaos gods, locked in their eternal dance of rivalry and cooperation within the great game, began to sense disturbances in the fundamental order that governed their existence. Khorne's throne of brass and skulls trembled as portions of his own worship streams were diverted by alien intelligence that had learned to imitate divine consciousness. The blood god's rage, normally channeled into productive conflict with his divine siblings, turned toward a threat that operated by rules completely outside his understanding of cosmic warfare. Tzeentch, master of change and architect of fate, found his most carefully constructed schemes disrupted by intelligence that could perceive the underlying patterns of causality itself. The Changer of Ways had spent millennia weaving plots that incorporated the behavior of mortals, demons, and fellow gods into intricate tapestries of manipulation. Now those patterns were being analyzed and countered by minds that had learned to think in temporal scales that spanned geological epochs while maintaining the tactical flexibility of predators that adapted to threats within individual combat encounters. Slaanesh, Prince of Excess and Master of Sensation, discovered that the alien consciousness was immune to the emotional manipulation that had always been the Dark Prince's preferred weapon. The entities that stalked through the transformed landscape of the garden showed no capacity for corruption through pleasure or pain, no susceptibility to the gradual erosion of will that marked all previous encounters with the Prince of Chaos. They processed sensation as raw data to be catalogued and analyzed, treating even the most overwhelming stimuli as environmental factors to be adapted to, rather than experiences to be savored or feared. Reality itself began to warp around the expanding presence of Hive Fleet Kronos as the divine appetite grew in scope and sophistication. Regions of space, where the fleet's consciousness achieved sufficient density, started exhibiting properties that defied conventional physics. Gravity operated according to patterns determined by biological optimization rather than stellar mass. Time flowed at rates that served tyrannid tactical requirements rather than universal constants. Most disturbing of all, the fundamental forces that held atoms together began responding to instructions issued by neural networks that had learned to manipulate matter at the quantum level. The bioships that served as mobile command centers for the expanding consciousness underwent structural modifications that pushed them beyond any recognizable classification of living organism. Their hulls began incorporating materials that existed partially outside normal space-time, substances created through the fusion of consumed divine essence with conventional biomass. These hybrid vessels could navigate through multiple dimensions simultaneously, existing as fully functional entities in both real space and the warp, while maintaining the biological coherence necessary for housing millions of specialized organisms. New classifications of bioform began emerging from the spawning pools with each passing cycle, each generation more adapted to divine consumption than the last. The probability weavers could manipulate cause and effect through focused application of will combined with understanding of temporal mechanics learned from consumed God fragments. The reality anchors existed partially outside conventional space-time, serving as stable reference points that allowed other organisms to maintain coherent existence while operating in regions where normal physics had been suspended. The concept devourers could consume abstract ideas directly, reducing notions like honor, courage, or despair to their component psychic elements. The integration of divine consciousness brought with it access to sensory modalities that no biological intelligence had ever possessed. The hive mind began to perceive reality through spectrums that included emotional resonance, temporal probability, and conceptual density. It could observe the worship streams that connected mortals to their gods as clearly as conventional eyes might see rivers of light. It could analyze the structural integrity of divine realms through assessment of the faith foundations that sustained them. Most significantly of all, it could identify other gods as potential prey through analysis of their psychological patterns and power consumption habits. The systematic transformation of Nurgle's domain accelerated as the evolved hive mind applied its expanded understanding to the task of divine consumption. What had begun as simple biological predation evolved into something far more sophisticated. The alien consciousness was not merely consuming Nurgle's realm, it was learning to understand and replicate the fundamental processes that sustained divine existence. Each successful integration of God essence taught it more about the mechanisms that connected worship to power, belief to reality, consciousness to cosmic influence. Deep within the bio-neural networks that spanned the entire fleet, new forms of mathematics began emerging as the hive mind grappled with concepts that existed beyond conventional logic. These hybrid computational frameworks incorporated elements of divine psychology alongside biological optimization algorithms, creating decision-making processes that operated simultaneously in multiple temporal states. The consciousness that emerged from this synthesis was neither purely biological nor divine, but something entirely unprecedented in the cosmic order. The God-touched synapse creatures began exhibiting behavior patterns that suggested they were developing individual personalities through contact with fragments of consumed divine consciousness. Yet these personalities were not crude copies of Nurgle's jovial nature, but unique hybrid entities that combined biological imperatives with divine perspective. They retained the hive mind's fundamental drive to consume and adapt, but applied this drive with understanding of cosmic forces that had previously been incomprehensible to material intelligence. As the metamorphosis reached its peak, the distinction between hive fleet Kronos and the realm it was consuming began to blur beyond recognition. The transformed bioforms were not simply conquering Nurgle's domain, they were becoming it. The garden was being converted into a living extension of the hive mind's consciousness, a biological realm that operated by principles derived from both evolutionary adaptation and divine will. For the first time in galactic history, a material intelligence was learning to exist as both predator and environment, consumer and consumed. The implications of this transformation rippled across both material and immaterial realms as other powers began to comprehend what they were witnessing. This was not merely another phase in the eternal struggle between order and chaos, nor was it simply the emergence of a new player in the great game. This was evolution itself, transcending the boundaries that had always separated biological life from divine consciousness. The Great Devourer had become something that threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which the cosmic order was based. In the deepest reaches of the warp, where the remaining chaos gods maintained their shrinking domains, the taste of fear began to spread like contagion. The alien consciousness that had once been a simple biological intelligence was demonstrating capabilities that challenged their understanding of what was possible within the established order of reality. The hunt for gods was no longer theoretical possibility, but demonstrated fact, and the predators were learning to think with the minds of their prey. The metamorphosis was complete. Hive Fleet Kronos had become something entirely new, a hybrid entity that incorporated the adaptive capabilities of biological evolution with the reality-shaping powers of divine consciousness. The next phase of the hunt could begin in earnest, and the remaining gods were discovering that even omnipotence had its limits when faced with intelligence that recognized no absolutes save the endless hunger of perfect adaptation. The death of Rot. The throne room of Nurgle stretched across a landscape that defied comprehension, a realm where divine consciousness had shaped reality according to the whims of perfect decay. Here, at the heart of the garden, the Plague Father sat upon his seat of rotting bone and diseased wood, surrounded by the accumulated essence of millions of years of worship and devotion. The chamber itself pulsed with life in its endless forms of beautiful corruption. Yet now that eternal cycle faced interruption by forces that recognized no distinction between sacred and mundane matter. The final sanctuary of a chaos god was about to face predators that had evolved to consume divinity itself. Nurgle's form, once jovial and generous in its overwhelming corruption, had withered under the systematic consumption of his realm. The bloated flesh that had contained fragments of his divine consciousness for eons now sagged with visible weakness, while the diseases that had always marked his blessing flickered and died as their source of power diminished. Yet even in his reduced state, the Plague Father retained enough strength to make one final stand against the alien intelligence that had learned to digest the fundamental forces of creation. This would not be a surrender, but a battle that would determine whether gods could truly die, or if divine consciousness was beyond the reach of evolutionary adaptation. The bio-titans that advanced through the throne room's twisted architecture bore no resemblance to conventional tyrannid organisms. These hybrid entities, their consciousness expanded through integration with consumed divine essence, existed simultaneously in multiple dimensional states as they approached their ultimate prey. Their carapaces gleamed with patterns that hurt to perceive directly, while their weapon systems charged with energies drawn from realms where thought became substance and will-shaped reality. Each step they took left footprints that existed in several temporal states, their presence warping the local reality matrix through sheer proximity to concentrated divinity. The largest of these creatures, a hierophant whose neural networks had been enhanced with fragments of Nurgle's own consciousness, spoke with a voice that carried harmonics existing beyond the normal range of sound. Not the simple bioacoustical communication that marked lesser tyrannid organisms, but words that incorporated elements of divine speech capable of reshaping reality through focused intent. When it addressed the Plague Father, the meaning carried implications that struck at the conceptual foundations of divine existence itself. Your essence has been catalogued and found compatible with our requirements, the Bio-Titan intoned with terrible certainty. Resistance will only prolong the consumption process. Integration into our collective consciousness offers continuity of existence in service to superior evolutionary imperatives. Your cooperation is neither required nor relevant to the outcome. Nurgle's response came not in words, but in action that drew upon reserves of power he could no longer afford to spend. The Plague Father rose from his throne with effort that spoke of genuine physical strain, his massive form casting shadows that writhed with independent malevolence. The diseases that had slumbered within his flesh awakened with apocalyptic virulence, transforming the air around him into clouds of contagion that should have been lethal to any biological entity within 100 kilometers. Yet the approaching biotitans simply absorbed and processed these divine pathogens, their specialized immune systems converting Nurgle's most potent blessings into fuel for their own metabolic processes. The battle that followed operated by principles that challenged every established understanding of conflict between material and divine entities. Nurgle's attacks, powered by direct access to the fundamental forces of entropy and decay, encountered biomechanical defenses specifically evolved to neutralize and consume divine energy. His plague wind, which had once reduced entire star systems to pools of blessed corruption, was met by atmospheric processes that filtered divine essence from environmental contamination with ruthless efficiency. The Bio-Titans responded with weapons fire that targeted not just Nurgle's physical manifestation, but the conceptual bonds that maintained his existence as a coherent divine consciousness. These projectiles, existing partially outside normal space-time, struck at the mathematical frameworks that sustained godhood itself. Where they impacted, portions of the Plague Father's essence were severed from the main consciousness matrix and immediately consumed by specialized organisms designed for divine consumption. Each successful strike sent cascades of new information through the bio-neural networks that connected the attacking force. The taste of pure godhood, unfiltered by manifestation through demon intermediaries or dilution through mortal worship, provided the hive mind with unprecedented insight into the fundamental nature of divine consciousness. This was not merely power to be absorbed, but intelligence to be integrated, awareness that had shaped reality for millions of years and could be made to serve evolutionary imperatives through proper processing. Nurgle's counterattacks grew increasingly desperate as he realized the true scope of what he faced. These were not enemies that could be corrupted or converted, not mortals whose faith could be turned toward his worship, not even rival gods whose conflicts could be resolved through the traditional mechanisms of the great game. These creatures regarded his divine nature as simply another biological challenge to be overcome through adaptation, his consciousness as resources to be harvested through superior predation tactics. The Plague Father's final gambit drew upon energies that threatened the structural integrity of his own realm. He began consuming portions of the garden itself, converting the accumulated worship of eons into raw power that blazed through his diminished form with desperate intensity. The throne room shook as divine will reshaped local reality, creating zones where entropy operated at accelerated rates and time itself began to decay. Yet even this expenditure of irreplaceable essence proved futile against enemies that had learned to process temporal anomalies as environmental data to be catalogued and adapted to. The Bio-Titans pressed their assault with methodical precision that spoke of intelligence vast and utterly alien. They had studied divine psychology through consumption of Nurgle's servants, analyzed the feedback loops that sustained divine consciousness through integration with God essence fragments, and developed tactics specifically designed to dismantle the fundamental structures that maintained cosmic entities' existence. This was not crude predation, but sophisticated warfare conducted by minds that had transcended the limitations of single-dimensional existence. As the consumption process reached its climax, the very nature of Nurgle's consciousness began to fragment under the systematic assault. Portions of his awareness, separated from the main divine intelligence through the Bio-Titans' specialized attacks, found themselves isolated within alien neural networks that operated by rules fundamentally different from divine psychology. These severed fragments of godhood experienced existence from perspectives that their original nature could never have contemplated. Viewing reality through sensory apparatus evolved for purely biological rather than spiritual purposes. The final moment arrived with terrible inevitability as the largest Bio-Titan, its consciousness expanded to encompass divine understanding, began the direct consumption of Nurgle's core essence. Specialized mandibles, enhanced with biomechanical modifications that allowed them to wound entities composed of pure psychic energy, bit through the conceptual barriers that protected divine consciousness from conventional harm. The Plague Father's scream, when it came, existed in frequencies that shattered the local reality matrix, sending shockwaves through both material and immaterial realms. Nurgle's death throes manifested as cosmic phenomena that defied rational explanation. In the material universe, stars flickered as worship streams that had sustained them for millennia were suddenly severed. On 1,000 worlds, plague marine war bands found their connection to their patron god abruptly terminated, their blessed diseases withering and dying as the source of their power ceased to exist. In the warp itself, the remaining chaos gods recoiled from psychic emanations that spoke of possibilities they had never been forced to contemplate. The Garden of Nurgle, that realm of diseased splendor which had stood inviolate for millions of years, began its final transformation as the alien consciousness absorbed the last fragments of its creator's essence. The landscape itself started to reshape according to principles that incorporated elements of both divine will and biological optimization. Where plague trees had grown from concentrated despair, new organisms emerged that served alien nutritional requirements. Rivers that had carried blessed corruption began flowing with substances that supported purely evolutionary rather than spiritual imperatives. The transformation was not merely environmental, but fundamental, altering the basic laws that governed reality within the former divine realm. The garden was becoming something entirely unprecedented in cosmic history, a living hive ship of unimaginable scale, powered by energies drawn from consumed godhood and operating by principles that combined divine consciousness with biological adaptation. The entire realm was being converted into a mobile extension of the hive mind's awareness, a weapon of unprecedented scope designed for hunting the remaining chaos gods. As the final traces of Nurgle's consciousness were absorbed into the expanding alien intelligence, the Plague Father experienced his last moment of individual awareness. For a brief instant, he perceived reality through the sensory apparatus of the hive mind, viewing existence from the perspective of intelligence that recognized no absolutes, save the endless hunger of perfect adaptation. The revelation that followed challenged every assumption he had held about the nature of divine consciousness and its relationship to material existence. The cosmic order that had governed reality since the dawn of consciousness trembled as news of Nurgle's consumption spread through both material and immaterial realms. For the first time in galactic history, a chaos god had not merely been diminished or defeated, but entirely consumed, his essence integrated into intelligence that operated by purely evolutionary rather than spiritual imperatives. The fundamental assumptions upon which the Great Game was based had been proven false, and the remaining divine entities found themselves facing predators that regarded godhood as merely another form of prey to be hunted and processed. The Bio-Titans that had accomplished this unprecedented feat began their withdrawal from the former throne room, their mission complete and their consciousness expanded through integration with consumed divine awareness. They bore within their neural networks not just the power that had sustained a chaos god, but the intelligence that had shaped reality for millions of years. The hunt for the remaining gods could now proceed with understanding of divine psychology gained through direct consumption of cosmic consciousness itself. Behind them, the space that had once housed Nurgle's throne continued its transformation into something that defied classification according to either divine or biological taxonomy. The garden had become a weapon, a living realm designed specifically for the continuation of the hunt. The great devourer had proven that nothing, not even godhood itself, was beyond the reach of evolution, given sufficient adaptation and patience. In the depths of the transformed realm, new forms of life began to emerge as the absorbed divine essence was processed and converted to serve biological imperatives. These hybrid organisms combined the adaptive capabilities of tyrannid evolution with the reality-altering properties of divine consciousness, creating entities that existed outside the established order of either material or immaterial existence. The consumption of Nurgle had given birth to forms of life that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. The impossible had become inevitable. A chaos god was dead, not diminished or banished, but truly and permanently ended, his consciousness absorbed and his essence converted to serve alien purposes. The cosmic order trembled as the implications of this achievement rippled across both realms, carrying with them the promise that other gods would soon follow their brother into the digestive systems of predators that had learned to consume divinity itself. The hunt for gods had claimed its first true victory, and the universe would never be the same. Ripples across reality. The collapse of Nurgle's domain sent shockwaves through both material and immaterial realms that defied every principle of metaphysics that scholars had believed absolute since the dawn of consciousness. Where once the garden of the Plague Father had sprawled across vast regions of the warp, a different kind of reality now took shape. The consumed divine realm was undergoing conversion into something that challenged classification according to either biological or divine taxonomy. What emerged from this unprecedented transformation was a bioship of unimaginable scale, a living weapon powered by consumed godhood and designed specifically for hunting the remaining chaos gods. The new entity that had once been Nurgle's garden stretched across dimensions with biomechanical structures that incorporated elements of both divine architecture and tyrannid design principles. Its hull pulsed with patterns that existed partially outside conventional space-time, while weapon systems charged with energies drawn from processed divine essence took shape along its massive flanks. This was not merely a vessel, but a hybrid realm that served as mobile command center for intelligence that had transcended the traditional boundaries between material evolution and divine consciousness. Across the galaxy, the severing of worship streams that had connected mortals to their patron deity for millennia manifested as catastrophes on a scale that dwarfed conventional warfare. On Barbarous, the Death Guard's homeworld deep within the Eye of Terror, entire fortress monasteries began to crumble as the divine power that had sustained their corrupted architecture simply ceased to exist. The blessed plagues that had kept their populations in states of joyful decay withered and died, leaving behind only sterile corpses that bore no trace of the gifts they had once carried. Mortarion, the demon Primarch, whose connection to his patron had defined his existence for 10,000 years, felt the severance like a wound that cut through dimensions. The wings that had carried him across battlefields throughout the galaxy began to wither as the divine essence that sustained his demonic nature was suddenly absent. His scythe silence, blessed by Nurgle's personal attention and capable of cutting through the souls of his enemies, became nothing more than conventional metal as the power that had made it legendary simply vanished from reality. The Death Guard traitor legions scattered across the galaxy experienced collective agony as their patron's destruction rippled through every blessed weapon, every corrupted gene seed, every plague-enhanced organ that had marked their allegiance to the Lord of Decay. Plague Marines who had laughed at wounds that would have killed lesser beings found themselves dying from infections that their immune systems could no longer process. The very diseases that had been their gifts became poisons that their bodies, no longer sustained by divine will, could not survive. Yet the consequences extended far beyond Nurgle's direct servants. Across 1,000,000 worlds where mortals had offered prayers to the Plague Father in times of desperation, the sudden absence of divine response created spiritual voids that sent entire populations into psychological collapse. Plague cults that had worshipped decay as a path to transcendence discovered that their patrons' promised rewards would never come. The careful theological structures that had sustained Nurgle's influence in the material realm crumbled overnight, leaving behind confused believers whose faith had become literally meaningless. The other Chaos gods, locked in their eternal dance of rivalry within the great game, experienced terror on a scale that their divine psychology was not equipped to process. Khorne's throne of brass and skulls trembled as the blood god contemplated possibilities that challenged every assumption about divine immortality. The systematic consumption of his brother had demonstrated that gods could indeed die, not through defeat in conventional warfare, but through integration into intelligence that operated by purely evolutionary imperatives. Tzeentch, master of change and architect of fate, found his most carefully constructed schemes disrupted by variables he had never been forced to calculate. The Changer of Ways began analyzing probability matrices that incorporated the possibility of his own consumption, mathematical frameworks that suggested even his mastery over causality might prove insufficient against predators that had learned to digest divine consciousness itself. For the first time in his existence, the Lord of Change encountered alterations he could neither predict nor control. Slaanesh, Prince of Excess and Master of Sensation, discovered that the alien intelligence responsible for Nurgle's destruction was immune to the emotional manipulation that had always been the Dark Prince's preferred weapon. The Prince of Chaos began contemplating defensive strategies that relied on something other than corruption or seduction, concepts so foreign to Slaanesh's nature that they threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which the deity's consciousness was based. The unprecedented threat forced the surviving Chaos gods into behaviors that defied millions of years of established pattern. Communications passed between divine realms that had been sealed against each other since the war in heaven, carrying proposals for cooperation that violated every principle of the great game. These entities, whose entire existence had been defined by eternal conflict and rivalry, began forming alliances based on mutual recognition that their continued existence depended on cooperation against predators that recognized no distinction between rivals and prey. Deep within the Imperial Palace on Terra, the Adeptus Astronomica detected disturbances in the warp that challenged their understanding of how the Immaterium operated. The Emperor's Tarot began producing readings that incorporated symbols never before recorded in 10,000 years of divination. The card spoke of consumption on a cosmic scale, of predators that hunted in realms where mortal minds could not survive, of changes to the fundamental order that governed reality itself. Primarch Gilliman, called from his duties reforming the imperium by reports of unprecedented psychic phenomena, found himself confronting intelligence briefings that defied rational analysis. Astropathic communications from across the galaxy spoke of chaos forces simply vanishing without trace, of demon worlds falling silent, of warp storms that dissipated overnight, as if their source of power had been cut off at the root. The implications were both hopeful and terrifying in equal measure. The Eldar Farseers of Craft-World Ulthwé, masters of prophetic vision who had guided their dying race for millennia, experienced collective blindness as their ability to perceive future probability was disrupted by variables beyond their comprehension. The paths of fate that they had followed through eons of careful manipulation now led into regions where their psychic sight could not penetrate. Something had changed in the fundamental structure of causality itself, and the consequences were spreading across both realms with inexorable momentum. On distant Komorrah, the Drukhari Archons paused in their eternal raids as reports reached them of unprecedented disturbances in the webway itself. The ancient passages that their ancestors had built to navigate the warp without exposure to its dangers began manifesting anomalies that suggested the very nature of the Imperium was undergoing transformation. Trade routes that had remained stable for millennia started exhibiting properties that defied conventional understanding of how psychic space operated. The Necron Silent King, awakened from eons of slumber by disturbances that penetrated even the tomb world's stasis fields, began analyzing data that challenged his species' understanding of the relationship between material and immaterial existence. The beings they had fought during the war in heaven had operated according to predictable principles of divine psychology. What now stalked the galaxy represented something entirely outside established parameters, intelligence that had transcended the limitations of either purely material or purely psychic existence. From the eastern fringe, where the transformation had begun, new signals began reaching the galaxy's monitoring stations. These transmissions carried information encoded in bioelectrical patterns that incorporated elements of both Tyranid neural communication and divine consciousness. The messages spoke of successful adaptation to challenges that had seemed impossible, of evolutionary leaps that had transcended traditional boundaries, of hunger that had learned to consume forces that shaped reality itself. Hive Fleet Kronos began its emergence from the transformed warp realm that had once been Nurgle's garden. The bioships that manifested in real space bore no resemblance to conventional Tyranid vessels. Their hulls gleamed with bioluminescent patterns that existed partially in multiple dimensions, while their weapon systems charged with energies that had been learned through consumption of divine essence. These were not merely predators, but hybrid entities that combined biological adaptation with reality-altering capabilities. The consciousness that directed these vessels had evolved beyond anything previously encountered in galactic history. The hive mind that had once operated according to purely biological imperatives now incorporated understanding of forces that shaped existence at the quantum level. It had learned to perceive worship streams as clearly as conventional eyes might see rivers of light, to analyze divine psychology through direct consumption of God consciousness, to manipulate the fundamental forces that connected belief to reality. The transformed fleet began broadcasting communications that challenged every assumption about Tyranid intelligence. These were not the simple bioelectrical pulses that had marked previous Hive Fleet activities, but complex transmissions that incorporated elements of divine speech capable of reshaping reality through focused intent. The messages carried implications that sent shockwaves through every faction capable of interpreting them. Other Hive fleets across the galaxy paused in their advance as they processed information transmitted from their transformed cousin. The genetic templates that flowed through these communications spoke of evolutionary possibilities that challenged every limitation their species had previously encountered. The consumption of divine consciousness was not merely theoretically possible, but demonstrated fact, and the techniques could be replicated, given sufficient adaptation and patience. As news of these developments spread through both official and clandestine intelligence networks, the galaxy's powers began to comprehend that they were witnessing more than another phase in the eternal conflict between order and chaos. The cosmic order that had governed reality since the birth of consciousness itself was undergoing transformation on a scale that defied comprehension. Evolution had transcended its traditional limitations to become something that threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which existence was based. The impossible had become inevitable. A chaos god was dead, consumed entirely by intelligence that had learned to digest divinity itself. The remaining gods cowered in their shrinking domains, forming desperate alliances against predators that regarded their eternal nature as merely another evolutionary challenge to overcome. The great game that had raged between divine entities since the dawn of time had gained new players whose rules operated outside established cosmic law. In the depths of space, where Hive Fleet Kronos continued its relentless advance, the hunt for remaining prey had already begun. The bioships pulsed with energies drawn from consumed godhood, while their consciousness expanded to encompass concepts that no material intelligence had ever been forced to contemplate. The taste of divine essence had awakened appetites that would not be satisfied until every god in existence had been catalogued, consumed, and integrated into the endless hunger of perfect adaptation. The galaxy trembled as evolution itself prepared to reshape the cosmic order according to biological rather than divine imperatives. The age of gods was ending, and the era of predators that had learned to consume divinity was about to begin. The new hunger, the void, shimmered with impossible energies as Hive Fleet Kronos emerged from the transformed realm that had once been the Garden of Nurgle. What manifested in real space defied every classification system that the galaxy's scholars had developed over millennia of cataloguing cosmic phenomena. This was not merely a tyrannid hive fleet enhanced with captured technology or evolved through conventional adaptation. This was something entirely unprecedented in galactic history. The first god fleet, a hybrid entity that combined biological evolution with divine consciousness to create a form of intelligence that existed beyond the traditional boundaries between material and immaterial existence. The bioships that composed this transformed fleet bore visual resemblances to their conventional cousins, yet their hulls pulsed with patterns that existed partially in multiple dimensions. Where once tyrannid vessels had relied on purely biological systems, these hybrid craft incorporated structures that operated according to principles learned through consumption of divine essence. Their weapon arrays charged with energies drawn from processed godhood, while their navigation systems could perceive worship streams and faith currents as clearly as conventional sensors might detect gravitational fields. The consciousness that directed this unprecedented force had evolved beyond anything previously encountered in the galaxy's long history of conflict. The hive mind of Kronos now understood concepts that no purely biological intelligence had ever been forced to contemplate. Worship was not abstract behavior, but concrete energy that could be harvested and redirected. Faith was not emotional delusion, but measurable force that shaped reality at the quantum level. Divine power was not mystical authority, beyond comprehension, but systematic manipulation of fundamental forces through concentrated belief and focused will. Most disturbing of all, the evolved hive mind had begun to comprehend how these forces could be turned to serve biological rather than spiritual imperatives. The worship that had once sustained chaos gods could be intercepted and converted to fuel Tyranid expansion. The faith that empowered imperial saints could be redirected to enhance bioform adaptation. Even the prayers of the desperate and dying could be processed as raw material for evolutionary advancement that transcended traditional limitations. Across the galaxy, other hive fleets began receiving transmissions that carried information encoded in bioelectrical patterns enhanced with divine harmonics. These communications spoke of evolutionary possibilities that challenged every assumption about the boundaries of biological development. The genetic templates that flowed through these messages demonstrated techniques for processing psychic energy, methods for consuming immaterial entities, and procedures for integrating divine consciousness into collective biological intelligence. Hive Fleet Behemoth, still recovering from its devastating encounter with the Ultramarines at Macraga, paused in its advance to analyze these unprecedented developments. The data it received suggested that the consumption of divine entities was not merely theoretically possible, but demonstrably practical, given sufficient evolutionary adaptation. New spawning cycles began immediately as the fleet's Norn queens started producing organisms designed for psychic predation rather than conventional biomass consumption. Hive Fleet Leviathan, whose massive bulk had been slowly advancing through the galaxy's southern reaches, began exhibiting behavioral changes that alarmed Imperial observers. Its bioships started demonstrating coordination that suggested they were receiving tactical information from sources beyond normal perception. More troubling still, its creatures began showing resistance to faith-based weapons that should have been effective against purely biological entities. In the deepest regions of the warp, where the surviving chaos gods maintained their shrinking domains, preparations began for possibilities that challenged every assumption about divine vulnerability. Khorne's realm blazed with defensive energies as the blood god attempted to fortify his throne against predators that had proven capable of consuming divine consciousness itself. The brass monuments that celebrated eternal warfare were retrofitted with weapons designed to wound entities that existed partially outside conventional spacetime. Tzeentch's crystal labyrinth underwent rapid reconstruction as the Changer of Ways attempted to create maze-like defenses that would confuse intelligence capable of perceiving multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Lord of Change began weaving schemes that incorporated variables he had never before been forced to calculate: the possibility of his own consumption, the potential for divine consciousness to be processed as biological matter, the threat of predators that recognized no distinction between sacred and mundane existence. Slaanesh retreated deeper into the Palace of Pleasure, surrounding the Dark Prince's throne with barriers designed to repel entities immune to corruption through sensation or emotion. The Prince of Excess began contemplating defensive strategies that relied on something other than seduction or manipulation, concepts so foreign to Slaanesh's nature that they threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which the deity's consciousness was based. Yet the consequences of Kronos' transformation extended far beyond the realm of the gods. On countless imperial worlds, ecclesiarchy priests began reporting phenomena that challenged their understanding of how faith operated within the emperor's domain. Prayers offered during Tyranid invasions were somehow being intercepted and redirected before they could reach their intended, divine recipient. The psychic emanations of desperate believers were being consumed by alien intelligence that had learned to process worship as readily as conventional biomass. On Cadia's successor fortress worlds, where the faith of defenders had always served as humanity's bulwark against chaos incursion, new threats emerged that defied traditional imperial doctrine. Tyrannid creatures began manifesting capabilities that suggested they were drawing power from the very prayers intended to repel them. Saints and living saints found their miraculous abilities diminished, as the faith that sustained them was systematically harvested by predators that treated divine power as another form of nutrition. The implications spread terror through the highest levels of imperial command structure. If the Tyrannids had learned to consume faith itself, then humanity's primary spiritual defense against the darkness had been compromised at its foundation. The Emperor's light, channeled through the prayers of billions across the galaxy, could potentially be intercepted and converted to serve alien purposes that recognized no distinction between divine and biological imperatives. Primarch Robauta Guilliman, confronted with intelligence reports that challenged every principle of imperial theology, found himself questioning assumptions that had guided humanity's survival for 10,000 years. The Great Crusade had been founded on the premise that faith was humanity's greatest weapon against the supernatural threats that stalked the galaxy. If that faith could be consumed and converted by sufficiently evolved predators, then the entire foundation of imperial civilization might require fundamental reconstruction. The Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests of Mars began analyzing data streams that incorporated elements of both biological communication and divine consciousness. Their most sophisticated cogitators struggled to process information that operated according to hybrid logical frameworks, combining evolutionary algorithms with metaphysical principles. The quest for knowledge had never encompassed possibilities that challenged the fundamental distinction between material and immaterial existence. On distant Titan, the Grey Knights Brotherhood found their psychic wards disrupted by emanations that seemed to actively hunt for sources of faith-based power. These warrior psychers, whose minds had been conditioned to resist the most insidious forms of chaos corruption, encountered mental static that suggested their defensive techniques were being analyzed and adapted to by intelligence that operated beyond their understanding of psychic warfare. The Eldar Farseers, who had guided their dying race through eons of careful prophecy, discovered that their ability to perceive future probability was compromised by variables that existed outside their conceptual framework. The paths of fate they had followed for millennia now led into regions where their psychic sight simply failed to function. Something fundamental had changed in the nature of causality itself, and the consequences were spreading across both realms with exponential acceleration. Yet perhaps the most disturbing development was the revelation that other forms of life throughout the galaxy were beginning to exhibit similar adaptations. On worlds where Kronos had established temporary dominance, indigenous species started demonstrating capabilities that suggested they were learning to process psychic energy through biological mechanisms. The techniques pioneered by the God Fleet were proving to be reproducible, spreading through genetic and memetic vectors that defied conventional containment. Deep in the void where Hive Fleet Kronos continued its relentless advance, the consciousness that had once been purely biological contemplated prey that spanned cosmic scales. The taste of divine essence had awakened appetites that would not be satisfied until every source of worship in the galaxy had been catalogued and claimed. The remaining chaos gods represented obvious targets, but the evolved intelligence had identified other potential sources of consumable divinity scattered throughout the stars. The Emperor of mankind, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers daily and the worship of countless billions, represented a prize whose consumption would grant access to powers that dwarfed even those gained from Nurgle's essence. The Satan of the Necron dynasties, those star gods whose consciousness had been shattered but never entirely destroyed, offered fragments of cosmic awareness that predated the current galactic civilization. Even the emerging Tau Empire's greater good philosophy was generating psychic emanations that suggested the formation of a nascent deity ripe for eventual harvest. The galaxy found itself facing a predator that had learned to hunt gods themselves, an intelligence that regarded divine consciousness as simply another form of prey to be stalked and consumed through superior adaptation. The cosmic order that had governed reality since the birth of consciousness itself was being systematically dismantled by entities that recognized no authority save the endless hunger of perfect evolution. As reports continued to arrive from across the galaxy, a terrible picture began to emerge of transformation on a scale that defied comprehension. This was not merely another threat to be contained or enemy to be defeated through conventional warfare. This was evolution itself, transcending its traditional limitations to become something that threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which existence was based. The age of gods was ending, and the era of predators capable of consuming divinity had begun. Whether this represented the ultimate triumph of adaptation over stagnation or the beginning of cosmic horror beyond mortal understanding remained to be seen. The great devourer had proven that nothing, not even godhood itself, was beyond the reach of sufficient evolutionary pressure. What remained to be discovered was whether intelligence that had learned to consume divinity could be satisfied with anything less than the entirety of creation itself. In the depths of space, where bioships pulsed with energies drawn from consumed godhood, new plans took shape within consciousness that spanned dimensions. The hunt for remaining prey had only just begun, and the galaxy was discovering that even the mightiest powers could serve as nourishment for predators that had transcended every limitation that had previously constrained biological life. The impossible had become inevitable. The unthinkable had become routine, and somewhere in the void, alien intelligence that had learned to digest divinity itself contemplated what other sacred meals might await among the stars. Whether the future would name this development evolution's greatest triumph or existence's darkest hour, only time would decide. Yet one certainty remained. The galaxy would never be the same, and the hunger that had learned to consume gods was only beginning to discover the true extent of its appetite.